Travel accounts represented a dominant paradigm of writing for an 18th century obsessed with what Bishop Thomas Spratz called the plain style. It was inspired by the scientific revolution and Locke's philosophy. On one hand, as travel writing became the secularization of the pilgrimage narrative, which had ultimately spiritual goals, travel writing had ultimately material epistemological goals, which could be achieved not through renunciation as we saw in earlier pilgrimage narrative, but rather through the exploitation of a people and political interests of a nation's formation and colonial expansion. On another hand, an association can be drawn between travel writing and romanticizing the problematic truth claims of travelers in the Age of Hume and Voltaire. Therefore, we can say that travel writing in this period was a transitional mode of testimony between wonder and knowledge. Charles Patten claims that by the end of the 18th century, travel books were among the most widely read divisions of literature, second only to novels and romances. Travel literature emerged in letters, diaries, journals, biographies, travel narratives or travelogues, country house guides, ship logs, poems, plays, and the novel feeds on all of them. Historically, travel was often a necessity for trade, education like the Grand Tour, or religious pilgrimages. The rise of industrialization and paid holidays, coupled with the development of infrastructure and transportation like railways, allowed for more people to travel for leisure. From London as a source of topographical mystery to be penetrated even by its inhabitants, to the newly tourable country estates, from the recently domesticated wilds of Scotland and Ireland to the paths of the Grand Tour in Europe, and from the exotic lands across the seas to the life on the sea itself. The rhetorics of travel supplied hosts of models for narrative and imagery in the early novel. The novel is every bit as much as travel writing is an exercise in ethnographic observation, sharing an interest in closely observed and analyzed detail, in the similarities and differences of other cultures, in the remarkableness of the ordinary, and sometimes surprising familiarity of the unknown, and with journey at the center of both. Let us talk about the key characteristics of travel writing during this period. Writers claimed to have seen things firsthand, whether they actually had or not. And because of that, many texts would mix true observations with myths, legends, and sometimes outright lies. Travel writers often compared other cultures to European norms, usually unfavorably. The travel literature often subtly or blatantly justified colonialism by portraying others as exotic, savage, or in need of civilizing. A lot of travel literature was also based on scientific observation, where writers documented plants, animals, climates, and geography in great detail. Some popular examples of travel narratives could be Colonel Jack and Moll Flanders, which involves traveling to the New World, whilst the narrator in Memoirs of Cavalier journeys around Europe. This period also included parodies of travel books like A New Voyage Around the World or the supposedly authentic adventures of Captain Singleton. During this period, there was a fascination, bordering on obsession, with tales of pirates and explorers. The King of Pirates is a fictional autobiography of Captain Avery. The Mock Knight of Madagascar, which displays several of the characteristics of the major narratives. An historical account of the voyages and adventures of Sir Walter Raleigh with the discoveries and conquests he made for the Crown of England, pursues a patently imperialistic theme in advocating the colonization of Guyana. And then there is the general history of the pirates. Most of these works are by Daniel Defoe. He adapts the form of travel literature to provide a vehicle for imperial propaganda, which, when viewed in context, has a surprisingly specific focus. During the 17th and 18th century, European empires were expanding rapidly. Portugal, Spain, the Dutch, Britain, and France were all setting up shop across the globe. The scientific revolution and enlightenment brought a thirst for knowledge about people, places, flora, fauna, and customs. There was growing interest in curiosities from abroad, strange animals, new religions, exotic customs, all of which ended up in travel accounts. Colonialism colored a lot of this literature, sometimes explicitly, sometimes subtly, with authors often writing from a place of superiority over the lands they visited. So, in order to understand the travel novel, it makes sense that we discuss the colonial novel. Robinson Crusoe cries out for a study in its colonial context. Indeed, British colonialism informs nearly every feature of Daniel Defoe's first novel, also considered as the first English novel. Spatially, Robinson Crusoe illustrates that the vastness of the globe can bring a corresponding enlargement, rather than shrinking, of the venturing self, and can produce close self-reflection of a kind not easy to achieve in civilized society. Religiously, the novel demonstrates that a spiritual awakening can take place in isolation from society, and can be crystallized when an Englishman subordinates and converts a non-European other. Economically, Defoe's novel functions as an argument for the expansion of trade. And psychologically, Robinson Crusoe shows that relations with an alien other can hone an ego that can master both its own selfhood and the destiny of others. In short, Robinson Crusoe owes many of its most characteristic traits to the colonial context, and that's why it is known as the colonial novel. Curiously, some of the most provocative post-colonial analyses of Defoe's novel appear not in criticism, but in post-colonial literature such as Derek Walcott's Phantomine and J.M. Coetzee's Foe, works that write back to Defoe's master narrative of empire. Even more numerous are the frequent allusions to Robinson Crusoe, particularly the Crusoe-Friday relationship, in post-colonial theoretical discourse. The mere mention of Defoe's novel, or his protagonist's relationship to Friday, seems to encapsulate the colonial myth and the dynamics of colonial relationships in general. Edward Said, for example, alludes to Robinson Crusoe as a work whose protagonist is the founder of a new world, which he rules and reclaims for Christianity and England. References like Said's are common, yet there seems to be an odd attempt to avoid engaging the colonial elements of the text in a sustained way. The novel's status as the prototypical colonial novel helps to account for this neglect, seemingly making such analysis unnecessary. But I will be providing you with a colonial analysis of this entire book, and I will discuss the post-colonial theories surrounding it when I do my lectures on post-colonialism. As Defoe transforms colonialism through representation, Crusoe refashions himself in the island, in part through the imagination and language. By the power of naming his slave Friday, Crusoe transforms his island world through the agency of language, and particularly through a creative process of naming. By renaming Friday, Crusoe assumes possession of him. In making laws and giving names to places and things on the island, including himself, Crusoe both creates and assumes control over his island home, in the same way that Columbus assumed possession of the land of his namings. Like Defoe's novel, Crusoe's tendency to imagine and create through language his own reality reveals something of the nature of colonialism in general, that it involves an assembly of images and cultural constructs as well as material practices and circumstances. Crusoe's tendency to imagine himself in grandiose terms replicates something of what was occurring in the culture at large in the early 18th century. From 1688 on, England had been expanding, and the pride of Englishness had been swelling, particularly with reference to the country's overseas possessions. Imperialism began to influence English national identity as early as the mid-17th century, and the English continued to associate their national prominence with their colonial activities, whether it be trade or the acquisition of foreign territories. Nonetheless, Great Britain experienced a share of anxieties on the road to imperial greatness, both in its dealings with other European powers and its native subjects. But the British people's proclivity to view themselves and their international achievements with intense pride helped to neutralize those anxieties in much the same way Crusoe's imagined responses to potential dangers ease his fear. The English further elevated their concerns regarding their international status by becoming an increasingly self-referential society, seeing more of themselves in spite of their increasing contact with a diverse range of cultures. Or, we might more accurately say, seeing more of themselves through their contact with colonized people. The influence of the empire on the novel as a form can be traced to the most elemental of novelist conventions called the attention to individual character, which is the starting point of Ian Watt's landmark study, The Rise of the Novel. Watt introduces us to a term called formal realism, which refers to a set of narrative techniques used by novelists to create a sense of reality in their fiction, or a circumstantial view of an individual life. Watt identifies Robinson Crusoe as the first English novel precisely because of the detailed attention that Defoe gives to an ordinary individual. Though his journey towards selfhood begins on precarious grounds, he is nearly swallowed by a storm, enslaved by Moors, and shipwrecked on an uninhabited island frequented by cannibals and located in the middle of the Spanish Empire. Crusoe gradually learns how to assert himself over land and people. In short, the colonial setting facilitates Crusoe's individualism as he comes to recognize the unique place he occupies as a British Protestant in a world in which he is surrounded by religious and cultural others. So this is how we can say that Robinson Crusoe indicates ways in which the British colonial history makes the genre of the novel even possible. However, Watt attributes such individualism to the rise of capitalism and the spread of Protestantism. However, implicit in Watt's argument is the idea that colonialism helped to assist the development of capitalism. Individualism could have only arisen in 18th century England, which had a strong hold of Protestantism and material capitalism. Given the reach of Britain's trading and territorial empire during the 18th century, and the resulting effects of British subjectivity, it is not surprising that Robinson Crusoe, with its bold assertion of colonial authority by means of a single individual, emerged in England when it did, at a time when the British were struggling to establish a trading empire and competing with other European powers for territory and market abroad. Robinson Crusoe effectively diffused insecurities relating to Britain's social endeavors by affirming through Crusoe's character the exceptional nature of the English subject. However, Robinson Crusoe stands as an allegory, not as an exhibit of colonialism. Defoe had no direct experience with plantations, South American coastal peoples, ocean voyages, the slave trade, or a colonial economy. What he knew came through the play of his imagination on information from travel narratives, trade, geographies, etc. Therefore, what he played in Robinson Crusoe was a journey that merely resembled the colonial experience. Defoe himself likely acknowledged the distance between the reality of Britain's colonial endeavors and his representation. Nowak, who traces the influence of Dutch realist paintings on Defoe's fiction, suggests that Defoe's interest in painting was not so much in getting at the thing itself, but in the methods of deceiving the eye and the mind into accepting the presence of the representation as something that might have existed. Nowak concludes that Defoe eventually learned that he was working in a medium that was even more powerful than painting. In Robinson Crusoe, his formal realism works to enfold the myths of psychological and economic self-sufficiency in a texture of convincing detail. He transforms colonialism through the power of fictional representation into the adventures of a single man who masters an island, his native companion, and himself. In Britain's Forging the Nation 1707 to 1737, Linda Coley suggests that the British developed a sense of national identity as a result of anxieties relating to their international status. Although marked by a myriad of local and regional differences, Coley contends that the Welsh, Scots, and English defined themselves as Britain because they came to see themselves as a people apart and distinct from other nations and people. Britishness was superimposed over an array of internal differences in response to contact with the other. Specifically, Coley refers to the French and the other Catholic nations of Europe from whom the British distinguished themselves because of their common commitment to Protestantism and their market economy. Protestantism, in particular, served as a unifying agent during the 18th century conflicts with these other nations, which often involved colonial possessions and trade routes throughout the non-European world. Coley acknowledges the rivalries among competing Protestant denominations, but she contends that the gulf between Protestant and Catholic was still the most striking feature in the religious landscape of the 18th century. The constant threat of a Catholic monarchy being restored by force which could only have come about with the aid of France or Spain, and the persecution of Protestants throughout Europe heightened the English, Welsh, and Scots sense of separateness from other European nations. Due to military victories against such adversaries, Protestant Britons came to see themselves as God's chosen people and in His divine care. This is not to suggest that the British were necessarily an extremely pious people, but the Protestant worldview was such an elemental aspect of their culture that it informed their thinking and identity, even if regular church attendance was not a priority. Crusoe's religious views are especially crucial if we see him as a British Protestant, competing for territory with Catholic French and Spanish colonials. As Jack P. Green observes, the English overseas empire, from the beginning, defined itself in opposition to the Catholic Empire of Spain. Further, the island, a place where mutual respect and tolerance between Protestant and Catholic flourish, is ultimately Crusoe's creation and represents a distinctly English colony, deliberately contrasted with those of Crusoe's more typical Catholic competitors. Just before leaving his island for the last time, Crusoe, in a distinctly Protestant-like gesture, leaves a Bible with his island subjects, thereby calling the instrumental role that the Bible would play in Crusoe's own conversion and intimating the role the Bible will play in the spiritual lives of his island subjects. The religious overtones of Defoe's text thus provide a blueprint for a religiously sound colonial policy. Since colonialism brings colonizing people into contact with individuals of competing Christian creeds as well as non-Christians, colonialism must, as does Crusoe, establish a strong, liberal and principled policy on religion. Sectarian disputes are to be abandoned in favor of central truths and essential points of ethical behavior. Native populations are to be gently encouraged, not compelled, to accept Christianity. In addition, the British tended to view their empire as a trading empire during the first half of the 18th century, significantly different from the Spanish Empire, which, from the point of view of the British, was raised through conquest and territorial rule. British national identity was further solidified by the economic prosperity the country experienced during the 18th century. A chapter on trade in the 1718 issue of The Present State of Great Britain begins, "Next to the purity of our religion, we are the most considerable of any nation in the world for the vastness and extensiveness of our trade." Defoe himself associated global trade with national prominence, writing in 1726, "We are not only a trading country, but the greatest trading country in the world." Defoe saw the colonies as integral to the nation's commercial success, and the importance of colonial markets to the local economy was evident throughout the century. Of all the branches of our commerce, that to our colonies is the most valuable. It is by that alone we're enabled to carry out the rest, wrote George Littleton in 1739. Indeed, Defoe viewed colonial populations, including the natives, as potential customers and consumers of English goods. Crusoe's rescue and subsequent return to his island colony fulfilled Defoe's colonial vision by connecting the island to England and the commercial world through trade. Like the majority of his contemporaries, Defoe believed that Britain's colonial activities were carried on relatively peacefully. Defoe, who envied Spain's control of Central and South America, portrays Spain's involvement in the Americas as nothing more than a ruthless conquest for riches. "It could not be just for me to fall upon them," Crusoe explains as he considers attacking a group of cannibals. This would justify the conduct of the Spanish in all their barbarities practiced in America. In conversing with Friday, Crusoe learns that the cruelties of the Spanish in America have spread over to the whole countries and were remembered by all the nations from father to son. Hume, who suggests that Defoe's novel attempts to reconfigure the colonial experience by denying the harsh realities of colonial relationships and the similarities between civilized and savage cultures, contends that Defoe's portrayal of the Spanish allows Defoe to distance his English hero from the native cannibals and their supposedly savage practices. The Spaniards, Hume explains, are allowed to be like Crusoe, only not as efficient, and they're chosen to bear the brunt of the undeniable similarities between Europeans and the Carib. When Crusoe entertains thoughts that the Spanish castaways may have resorted to cannibalism in order to survive, Hume argues that the supposed gulf between civilized and savage societies remains intact, since the castaways are Spanish, not English. Moreover, Crusoe's self-sufficiency contrasts strikingly with the dependence of his Spanish counterparts on the native Caribs, thus validating the preeminence of Western civilization on a distinctly English model. This was all about Daniel Defoe and the travel narratives and travelogues that were popular during the 18th century. If you'd like to know more about the various forms that were popular during the 18th century, like the British novel, satire, or pamphlets, then have a look at these lectures.